How many quiet promises has a person made to themselves that no one else ever hears? The kind whispered in the dark just before sleep. The kind that feel honest in the moment, almost sacred, like a private contract between who they are and who they believe they could become. And yet by morning, those promises dissolve without a trace, not because they were lies, but because something softer, something far less dramatic, stepped in and took control. You see, people like to believe that failure arrives with noise, with chaos, with obvious mistakes, but in truth, it arrives quietly, wrapped in comfort, dressed in routine, speaking in a voice so gentle it never sounds like an enemy. It sounds like relief, and that is where the danger begins. Because relief does not argue, it does not push. It simply offers an easier option and waits for you to take it. And most people do, not once, not twice, but every single day, in ways so small they barely register. Like choosing to stay in bed when the alarm rings, not because the body needs rest, but because the warmth feels too good to leave. Like picking up the phone just to check something, and somehow losing an hour to things that will not matter tomorrow. Like telling yourself that starting later is still starting, that delaying is not the same as quitting. And this is where the mind plays its clever game, because it never says give up. It says not yet. And not yet feels harmless, almost responsible, almost wise, until it becomes a pattern. And patterns, once repeated enough, begin to feel like identity. And identity is a powerful thing, because once a person starts to see themselves as someone who delays, someone who hesitates, someone who negotiates with effort, it becomes harder to act against that image. Not impossible, but heavy, like trying to run with something tied around your waist that you cannot see but can always feel. And over time, this invisible weight grows, not because life becomes harder, but because the gap between intention and action stretches wider. And that gap is where frustration lives. It is where people start asking themselves questions they cannot easily answer, like, why do I keep doing this? Or, what is wrong with me? And the truth, though simple, is uncomfortable. Because nothing is wrong in the dramatic sense. There is no broken part waiting to be fixed. There is only a series of choices that have been repeated long enough to become automatic. And those choices are almost always guided by one principle. Avoid discomfort now, deal with consequences later. Except later never feels like later when it arrives. It feels like now again. And so the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats until years pass not in failure, but in delay. And delay has a peculiar way of disguising itself. It does not look like losing. It looks like waiting, like preparing, like getting ready. And people can spend an entire season of their life in that state, convincing themselves that they are on the edge of change while never actually stepping into it. And all the while, something else is happening beneath the surface. Something quieter, but far more permanent. Their tolerance for discomfort is shrinking, little by little, like a muscle that is never used. And in its place grows a dependence on ease, on quick rewards, on anything that provides relief without effort. And modern life, with all its conveniences, feeds this perfectly, because it offers endless ways to feel good without doing anything difficult. A screen that never runs out of content, food that requires no preparation, entertainment that fills every silent moment. And none of these things are evil on their own, but together, they create an environment where discomfort becomes optional. And when discomfort becomes optional, growth becomes unlikely. Because growth has always required a certain kind of friction, a willingness to step into something that does not feel good immediately. And most people, without realizing it, have trained themselves to step away from that feeling the moment it appears, like pulling a hand back from heat. Except in this case, the heat is effort, focus, uncertainty, the very things that lead somewhere meaningful. And so they drift, not dramatically, not in a way that alarms anyone around them, but slowly, quietly, like a boat untied from the dock, moving just enough each day that the distance is not noticeable, until one day they look up and realize they are far from where they intended to be. And that realization can be heavy, because it brings with it a question that cuts deeper than most. When did this happen? And the answer, if they are honest, is never a single moment. It is 1,000 small moments, 1,000 soft decisions that felt insignificant at the time, each one justified, each one understandable, each one easy. And that is the hardest part to accept, that the life a person ends up with is often built not on big choices, but on small, repeated ones, the kind that happen when no one is watching, the kind that feel too minor to matter, and yet they do. They matter more than people think, because they shape the direction of a day, and days shape weeks, and weeks shape years, and years, quietly, shape a life. And somewhere along that path, many people begin to feel a kind of restlessness they cannot fully explain, a sense that something is off, that they are capable of more, but somehow not accessing it, like standing in a room with a door they know exists, but cannot seem to open. And they look for complex answers, for strategies, for bursts of motivation, for something external to push them forward, not realizing that the real issue is far simpler and far more difficult at the same time. They have become too comfortable with comfort itself. They have built a life where the easiest option is always within reach, always justified, always chosen. And until that pattern is seen clearly, not judged, not dramatized, just seen for what it is, nothing changes. Because awareness is the first crack in that soft prison. The moment where a person begins to notice the quiet deal they have been making with themselves every day, trading a little bit of effort for a little bit of ease, over and over, until ease becomes the default and effort becomes the exception. And once that happens, even the thought of doing something difficult can feel heavier than it should, not because the task is impossible, but because the mind has been trained to resist it, to question it, to delay it. And so the question returns, sharper now, more direct, less forgiving. How many times will a person choose what is easy now, knowing it costs them later? And at what point do they stop calling it a small decision and start calling it what it really is? A pattern that is quietly shaping their entire life. There was a man people passed every day without noticing anything unusual about him. The kind of person who blended into the rhythm of ordinary life so well that even he had stopped questioning it. His name was Daniel. He lived in a small apartment that looked exactly like what you would expect from someone who was doing okay. Not struggling, not thriving, just steady. The kind of place where things worked but nothing really inspired. A bed that was too comfortable for its own good. A desk that held more distractions than tools. A kitchen stocked more for convenience than intention. And if you stepped into his life for a moment, you would not see failure. You would see routine. And routine has a way of hiding deeper truths because it feels safe. It feels acceptable. It feels like progress, even when it is not leading anywhere meaningful. And Daniel had built his days around that feeling without realizing it. Every morning began the same way, not with a decision but with a reaction. The alarm would ring, sharp and clear, cutting through the silence of early hours. And for a brief second, there was a window, a small, fragile moment where he could have chosen differently. But habit moved faster than thought. His hand reached out, not to rise, but to delay. And the words came almost automatically, not spoken out loud, but heard clearly inside his head. Just a few more minutes. And those minutes were never just minutes. They were the beginning of a pattern that would shape the entire day. Because when the first action of the day is avoidance, everything that follows carries that same tone. And so he would wake up later than he planned. Not dramatically late, just enough to feel slightly behind, slightly rushed, slightly out of sync. And that feeling would follow him into the rest of his morning. He would skip the things he once told himself were important. No time for exercise, no time for quiet focus. Just enough time to get ready and move, always moving, always catching up, never quite arriving. And he told himself it was fine, because from the outside, it was fine. He got to work, he completed tasks, he responded to messages, he did what was expected. And in a world where most people are simply trying to keep up, doing what is expected often passes as success. But there was a difference between doing enough and doing what mattered. And Daniel lived in that gap without naming it. His workday was filled with activity, emails, meetings, small tasks that gave the illusion of productivity, each one offering a quick sense of completion, a small reward that required little resistance. And over time, he began to prefer these tasks, not because they were important, but because they were easy to finish. They gave him something immediate, something tangible, unlike the deeper work he kept postponing. The kind of work that required long focus, uncertainty, effort without instant feedback. The kind of work that actually moved his life forward. And every time he chose the easier task over the meaningful one, he reinforced a quiet habit, not of laziness, but of preference, a preference for what felt manageable in the moment. And this preference did not stay contained to his work. It followed him home, into the evenings, where his real intentions used to live. Because there was a time, not long ago, when Daniel had plans, ideas he wanted to build, skills he wanted to develop, a version of himself he could almost picture clearly. But those things required energy, required attention, required stepping into discomfort after a long day. And that is where the pattern revealed itself most clearly. He would sit down just for a moment, open his phone, scroll without thinking, telling himself he needed a break. And maybe he did, but the break never ended where it should have. One video became 10, 10 became an hour, and an hour became the quiet disappearance of the evening. And by the time he looked up, it was too late to start anything meaningful. Not because time had truly run out, but because his mind had already shifted into a different state. A state that resisted effort, that preferred ease, that avoided anything that felt like work. And so he would tell himself again, "I'll do it tomorrow." And the cycle closed neatly, no drama, no guilt strong enough to break it. Just a quiet acceptance that tomorrow would somehow be different, even though it never was. And this is how days began to stack on top of each other. Not identical, but similar enough that they blurred together, each one carrying the same small compromises, the same delayed intentions, the same quiet trade between what he wanted long-term and what felt good short-term. And what made it more difficult to see was that nothing was falling apart. His life did not collapse. There were no obvious consequences demanding immediate change. And that is often the most dangerous place to be, because when things are fine, there is no urgency, no clear signal that something needs to shift. And so the pattern continues unchecked, growing roots, becoming normal, becoming identity. And Daniel began to describe himself in ways that reflected this without realizing it. He would say he was not really a morning person, or that he worked better under pressure, or that he just needed the right moment to start. And each of these statements felt harmless, even accurate, but together they formed a narrative that kept him exactly where he was. Because the mind believes what it repeats, and once a person begins to define themselves by their habits, those habits become harder to question, harder to break. And so even when he had moments of clarity, brief flashes where he could see the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be, those moments passed quickly, drowned out by the familiarity of his routine. Because routine, even when it limits us, feels safer than change. And Daniel was not unaware. He felt it in subtle ways, in the slight frustration at the end of the day, in the quiet thought that he could have done more, in the sense that time was moving faster than his progress. But feeling something is not the same as acting on it, and without action, awareness fades, and the cycle resets. And so he kept living like this, not stuck in a dramatic sense, but caught in a loop so ordinary it almost felt invisible. A loop built on small decisions that seemed insignificant in isolation, but powerful in repetition. And what made it even more real was how closely it mirrored the world around him. Because everywhere he looked, he saw the same patterns. People glued to their screens in waiting rooms, in elevators, even while walking, quick bursts of entertainment filling every empty second. Conversations about being busy without being fulfilled, about wanting change without taking steps toward it. And this normalized everything, it told him, without words, that this was just how life was now, that everyone felt this way, that everyone delayed, that everyone struggled to focus. And when a pattern feels universal, it becomes harder to question, easier to accept. And so Daniel continued, day after day, not failing, not succeeding in any meaningful way, just maintaining a rhythm that required no real resistance, and yet cost him something he could not immediately measure. Something that did not show up in his bank account or his calendar, but lived quietly beneath the surface. The slow fading of potential, the gradual dulling of ambition, the quiet shift from "I will" to "maybe later." And this shift did not happen all at once. It happened in moments so small they barely registered. The skipped morning, the delayed task, the extra hour of distraction, the choice to avoid rather than engage. And each of these moments, repeated enough times, became the structure of his life. A structure that felt stable but was built on avoidance. And the longer it stayed in place, the harder it became to imagine something different. Not because change was impossible, but because he had not practiced it. And what we do not practice, we begin to doubt. And so, even though the idea of becoming more focused, more disciplined, more intentional still existed in his mind, it felt distant, almost like something meant for a different version of himself. Someone who had more energy, more clarity, more drive. Not realizing that those qualities were not prerequisites for change, but results of it. And until that understanding shifted, he remained where he was, living a life that looked fine from the outside, but felt slightly off on the inside, like a song playing just a bit out of tune. Something you cannot always explain, but can always feel. And that feeling, though quiet, never fully disappeared. It stayed with him, waiting, not demanding, just present, like a reminder that beneath the routine, beneath the comfort, beneath all the small decisions that filled his days, there was still something unresolved, something unfinished, something that had not yet been given a real chance to exist. The shift did not arrive like a revelation. It did not break into Daniel's life with noise or urgency. It came in quietly, almost unnoticed, through a thought that felt too simple to matter at first. A thought that didn't accuse him, didn't shame him, just sat there and asked something slightly different from what he had been asking himself all along. Because until that point, Daniel kept circling the same question: why am I so undisciplined? And that question carried a hidden assumption, that something inside him was missing, broken, weaker than it should be. And every time he asked it, he reinforced that belief without realizing it. But one evening, after another day that looked productive on the surface and empty underneath, the question changed, not dramatically, just enough to shift the direction of his attention. What if I'm not undisciplined? What if I'm just trained differently? And that thought stayed longer than the others. It didn't fade the way frustration usually did. It lingered, because something about it felt uncomfortably accurate. And once it settled, it began to connect things he had never fully connected before. Like how easily he reached for his phone without thinking, how automatically he delayed difficult tasks, how consistent he was in choosing what felt easier in the moment. And for the first time, instead of seeing these as random failures, he began to see them as patterns, not accidental, not occasional, but repeated, predictable, almost mechanical. And that realization carried a different kind of weight. Because if something is a pattern, it means it has been practiced. And if it has been practiced, it means it can exist without conscious effort. And if it can exist without conscious effort, then it is not a lack of discipline. It is discipline directed somewhere else. And that was the part that unsettled him. Because it meant he was not someone who lacked control. He was someone who had been consistently controlling himself in the wrong direction. And once that idea took hold, it started to reframe everything. The mornings were no longer just lazy starts. They were rehearsed responses. The evenings were no longer just wasted time. They were repeated behaviors reinforced by immediate reward. And the more he looked at it this way, the clearer it became that his brain had not betrayed him. It had simply adapted. It had learned from what he gave it, and what he gave it, day after day, was a sequence of choices that prioritized comfort over effort, ease over challenge, immediate relief over delayed reward. And the brain, doing exactly what it is designed to do, optimized for that pattern. It built shortcuts, reduced resistance, made those choices faster, smoother, more automatic. And in doing so, it made the opposite choices harder. Not impossible, but unfamiliar. And unfamiliar always feels heavier than it actually is. And this is where Daniel began to see something he had missed for a long time. That his struggle was not happening at the level of motivation. It was happening at the level of conditioning. Because motivation comes and goes. It rises and falls with mood, with energy, with external factors. But conditioning stays. It shapes default behavior. It determines what feels natural and what feels forced. And for him, avoiding discomfort had become natural, while facing it felt forced. And that explained why, even when he felt motivated, even when he had a burst of energy or clarity, it rarely lasted. Because he was trying to act against a system that had been built over months, maybe years, of repetition. And systems do not change because of a single decision. They change because of consistent disruption. And that is a slower, less glamorous process than he had hoped for. But it was also more honest. And honesty has a way of cutting through illusion. Because once he saw this clearly, he could no longer tell himself the same story about being undisciplined. That label no longer fit. It was too simple, too shallow. It ignored the deeper mechanism at play. And in its place came a different understanding, one that felt less comfortable but more accurate. That he had been practicing the wrong habits with the same consistency he wished he had for the right ones. And this understanding did not immediately change his behavior. It did something more important first. It removed the excuse that he was somehow incapable. Because if discipline is something that can be trained, and he had already trained it in one direction, then it could, in theory, be trained in another. But theory and action are not the same, and this is where the next realization came in, one that was even less convenient, that willpower alone would not be enough to reverse this pattern. Because willpower operates like a limited resource. It can push against habit for a short time, but it cannot sustain that resistance indefinitely, especially in an environment that constantly triggers the old behavior. And when Daniel looked around his environment, really looked this time, not as a background but as a factor, he began to notice how much it was shaping him without his awareness. The phone always within reach, the notifications designed to pull his attention, the easy access to entertainment, the layout of his space that made distraction effortless and focus inconvenient. And it became clear that he was not just fighting himself. He was moving through a space that encouraged the very behaviors he was trying to change, and expecting himself to win that fight every day, through sheer will, was unrealistic. Not because he was weak, but because the system was stacked against consistency. And this is where the idea of control shifted again, from internal to external, from trying to force better decisions in the moment to designing conditions that made those decisions easier by default. And that shift was subtle but powerful, because it moved the focus away from constant struggle and toward deliberate structure. And for the first time, Daniel considered that maybe the goal was not to become someone who resists temptation perfectly, but someone who reduces the need to resist it in the first place. And that thought opened a different path, one that did not rely on sudden transformation, but on gradual adjustment, removing triggers instead of fighting them, creating spaces that supported focus instead of competing with it. And this did not mean eliminating all comfort. It meant redefining the role comfort played in his life, no longer as the default state, but as something earned, something placed after effort rather than before it. And as these ideas began to settle, they brought with them a kind of clarity that felt both relieving and confronting. Relieving because the problem was no longer mysterious, confronting because the solution required consistent action, not just understanding. And understanding without action changes nothing. And Daniel knew that, even if he had not always acted on it. But this time felt different, not because he was more motivated, but because he was seeing the structure behind his behavior. And once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. It becomes difficult to go back to thinking in simpler terms. And so, the question that once held him in place, why am I like this, no longer had the same power. It had been replaced by something more direct, more actionable. What am I repeating? And that question did not invite blame. It invited observation. And observation, when honest, leads to awareness. And awareness, when sustained, creates the possibility for change. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but realistically. And that realism, though less exciting than quick fixes, carried something far more valuable. It aligned with how people actually change, through small, consistent shifts that accumulate over time. And as Daniel sat with this, not rushing to act, not forcing a plan, just allowing the understanding to settle fully, he felt something he had not felt in a while. Not motivation, not excitement, but a quiet sense of direction, like finally seeing the map after walking in circles. And while the path ahead was still uncertain, it no longer felt invisible. And sometimes, that is enough to begin. It did not become easier the next day. And that is the part most people do not like to hear, because somewhere deep down, there is always the hope that once you understand the problem clearly enough, the solution will begin to feel lighter, more natural, almost automatic. But for Daniel, the first real attempt to act differently felt heavier than anything he had done before. Not because the task itself was difficult, but because he was moving against a current he had spent years reinforcing. And that current did not disappear just because he saw it. It pushed back, quietly but firmly, in the form of hesitation, in the form of thoughts that sounded reasonable. You can start later. Today is not the right day. Just prepare a little more. And each of these thoughts carried a familiar tone, the same tone that had guided his choices for so long. And for a moment, he almost followed it again, almost slipped back into the pattern without resistance, because that is what habits are designed to do. They wait, they repeat, they offer the same path with the same ease. But this time, something slowed him down. Not motivation, not a sudden surge of discipline, just awareness, a quiet recognition of what was happening in real time. And that recognition created a small gap, just enough space between the thought and the action. And in that space, he made a decision that did not feel powerful, did not feel inspiring. It felt awkward, slightly uncomfortable, almost unnecessary. But he did it anyway. He chose the harder option in that moment, not because he felt ready, but because he understood that waiting to feel ready was part of the pattern he was trying to break. And that first action, small as it was, carried a different kind of weight, not in how it looked, but in what it represented. It was not about the task itself. It was about interrupting a sequence that had been running automatically for so long. An interruption, even in small doses, begins to weaken repetition. And repetition is what gives habits their strength. And so he continued, not in a dramatic way, not with a complete overhaul of his life, but with small, deliberate choices that felt slightly uncomfortable each time. And that discomfort became the most noticeable part of the process. It was not sharp or overwhelming. It was subtle, persistent, like a quiet resistance that showed up whenever he stepped outside his usual pattern. And at first, he did not like it. He wanted it to go away. He wanted the new behavior to feel as easy as the old one. But slowly, through repeated exposure, his relationship with that discomfort began to change. It stopped feeling like a signal to stop and started feeling like a sign that he was moving in a different direction. And that shift, though small, was important, because the meaning we attach to a feeling often determines how we respond to it. And for a long time, Daniel had interpreted discomfort as something to avoid, something that indicated he was doing something wrong. But now, he began to see it as part of the process, not pleasant, not desirable, but necessary. And once that interpretation changed, his response changed with it. He no longer tried to escape the feeling immediately. He stayed with it a little longer, just enough to complete the task in front of him. And each time he did that, the intensity of the resistance decreased slightly, not because the task became easier, but because his tolerance for discomfort increased. And tolerance, like any capacity, grows with use. And this growth was not something he could measure directly. There was no clear marker, no visible sign that he was improving. It showed up in quieter ways, in the fact that he hesitated less, in the fact that he recovered faster when he slipped, in the fact that he began to act without overthinking every step. And these changes were subtle, easy to overlook if he had been looking for something dramatic. But they were real, and over time, they began to accumulate. And with that accumulation came a different kind of confidence. Not the loud, outward kind that demands attention, but a quieter, internal sense that he could rely on himself a little more than before. And that reliability did not come from perfection. It came from consistency, from showing up even when it was inconvenient, even when it was imperfect, even when the result was not impressive. And this is where the process slowed down even further, because once the initial awareness fades, what remains is repetition, and repetition can feel monotonous. It can feel like nothing is changing, like you are doing the same small actions over and over, without visible progress. And this is where many people stop, not because they cannot continue, but because they expect more feedback than the process provides. But Daniel had already seen what happened when he followed that expectation. He had lived in that loop long enough to recognize it, and so this time, he stayed. Not because it felt good, but because it made sense. And sometimes, that is enough to keep going. And as he continued, something else began to shift, something deeper than behavior. His sense of identity started to adjust, not through declarations, not through affirmations, but through evidence, small pieces of proof collected over time, each action reinforcing a slightly different image of himself, not someone who always delays, but someone who can act despite hesitation, not someone who avoids discomfort, but someone who can sit with it long enough to move forward. And identity, once it begins to shift, changes how decisions are made, because decisions are often less about what we want and more about who we believe we are. And as that belief evolves, so does the default choice. And this evolution was not sudden. It did not replace his old habits overnight. There were still days where he slipped, where he chose the easier path, where the old pattern resurfaced. But the difference now was in how he responded to those moments. He no longer used them as evidence that nothing had changed. He saw them as part of the process. as temporary returns to a pattern that was still losing its hold. And that perspective prevented the kind of discouragement that used to reset his progress completely. Instead of stopping, he adjusted. He returned to the next small action. And this ability to return, again and again, became one of the most important parts of his progress. Because consistency is not built on never failing. It is built on not staying down after failure. And over time, this created a rhythm. Not perfect, not rigid, but stable enough to carry him forward. And within that rhythm, the things that once felt difficult began to feel more neutral. Not easy, but less resistant. And that neutrality made them easier to repeat. And repetition, once it reaches a certain point, begins to create its own momentum. And momentum changes the experience of effort. It reduces the friction between intention and action. And this reduction is what people often mistake for discipline itself, when in reality, it is the result of repeated, disciplined actions. And as Daniel moved through this process, he began to understand something that had been unclear before, that discipline is not a trait you either have or do not have. It is a pattern you build, one action at a time, one decision at a time, often without feeling ready, often without feeling motivated. And this understanding did not make the process easier, but it made it clearer. And clarity has its own kind of strength. It removes the illusion that there is a shortcut, that there is a moment where everything suddenly clicks and becomes effortless. And in removing that illusion, it allows a person to commit to the reality of the process. Slow, repetitive, sometimes uncomfortable, but reliable. And in that reliability, something steady begins to form. Not a dramatic transformation, not a complete reinvention, but a gradual alignment between what he intended to do and what he actually did. And that alignment, even in small degrees, created a sense of integrity he had not felt in a while, a sense that his actions were beginning to match his intentions. And that feeling, though quiet, carried more weight than any temporary burst of motivation, because it was built on something real, something repeatable, something that did not depend on mood or circumstance. And as he continued, day after day, without rushing, without expecting sudden results, just following the process as it unfolded, he found himself in a place that once felt distant, not perfect, not complete, but different enough to notice. And sometimes, difference is all that is needed to keep going. Because once you see that change is possible, even in small ways, it becomes harder to return fully to where you were before. Not because you cannot, but because you no longer see it the same way. And that shift in perspective, once it takes hold, becomes part of the process itself, guiding each next step with a quiet, steady force that does not need to announce itself to be felt. And then, somewhere along that slow stretch of days that no one else would notice, something settled inside Daniel. Not like a victory, not like a finish line crossed, but like a quiet agreement he made with himself, and this time did not rush to break. An understanding that this path he had stepped onto did not promise ease, did not guarantee excitement, did not reward him every single day with visible results, but it offered something far more solid than anything he had relied on before. It offered continuity, and continuity, he began to realize, was the one thing his old life never truly had. Because before, everything depended on how he felt in the moment, on whether he had enough energy, enough clarity, enough motivation to act. And those things came and went like weather, unpredictable, inconsistent, impossible to build anything stable on. But now, the focus had shifted. Not toward feeling ready, but toward showing up, even when the feeling was absent, even when the day felt off, even when the effort seemed small compared to what he once imagined it should be. And this idea of showing up, simple as it sounded, carried a depth he had underestimated for years. Because showing up was not just about doing something, it was about maintaining a thread, a connection between one day and the next, a signal to his mind that the pattern was still alive, still continuing, still worth reinforcing. And he began to see how fragile that thread could be, how easily it could be broken not by failure, but by absence, by skipping entirely, by allowing a day to pass with nothing done at all. And once that happened, he noticed, the resistance to returning grew stronger, not weaker, because the mind, always looking for patterns, would interpret that gap as a shift, a new direction, a sign that the previous effort had ended, and starting again always felt heavier than continuing. And that is when the idea formed more clearly in his mind. not as a rule imposed from outside, but as something he understood through experience, that the goal was not perfection, not intensity, not even progress in the way he used to define it. The goal was to never drop to zero, to always keep something, no matter how small, moving forward. And this was harder than it sounded, not physically, but mentally, because there were days when everything in him resisted even the smallest action. Days when the old patterns whispered louder. Days when fatigue, distraction, or doubt made the simplest task feel unnecessary. And on those days, the temptation was not to do less, but to do nothing at all. To say, today doesn't count. To push everything to tomorrow. And Daniel had lived enough of those tomorrows to recognize where they led. And so, slowly, deliberately, he made a different kind of commitment. Not to be perfect, not to outperform himself, but to maintain the line, to keep the streak alive in whatever form he could. And that meant redefining what counted as enough, because in the past, his standards had been tied to ideal conditions, to versions of himself that only showed up on good days. And when those conditions were not met, he did nothing. But now, he allowed the standard to adjust, not as an excuse, but as a strategy. If he could not do an hour of focused work, he would do 10 minutes. If he could not complete a full routine, he would do a small part of it. If he could not give his best, he would still give something, because something, he had learned, sustains the pattern, while nothing breaks it. And this approach did not feel impressive. It did not create moments he wanted to talk about or share, but it built something underneath, something steady, something that did not collapse when circumstances changed. And over time, this steadiness began to show in ways that were difficult to ignore. Not in dramatic leaps, but in the absence of regression, in the fact that he no longer returned to zero, no longer lost entire days to the same patterns that once controlled him. And that alone created a sense of progress that felt more real than anything he had experienced before, because it was not dependent on peaks, it was sustained through consistency. And as this consistency continued, it began to influence how he saw himself, not through words, but through evidence, repeated proof that he could rely on his actions, even when his feelings were uncertain. And that reliability changed something deeper than behavior. It changed his sense of trust in himself. And trust, once built, reduces the need for constant internal debate. Because when you trust that you will act, you spend less time questioning whether you should. And that reduction in hesitation creates space, mental space that was once occupied by negotiation, by excuses, by overthinking. And in that space, action becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. And clarity reduces friction, and less friction makes repetition more likely. And repetition, sustained over time, becomes identity, not declared, not forced, but formed through evidence. And Daniel began to notice this shift in subtle ways, in how he responded to challenges, in how quickly he returned after setbacks, in how he no longer framed his days around whether he felt motivated, but around whether he had shown up. And this shift, though quiet, carried a different kind of strength, because it was not tied to outcomes, it was tied to process. And process, unlike outcomes, is always within reach, always available, always something he could return to. And as he continued to live this way, not perfectly, not without resistance, but consistently enough to maintain the pattern, he began to understand something that once felt abstract. That discipline is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you practice daily, something that exists only as long as it is maintained, like a rhythm that fades when it is not continued. And this understanding did not discourage him. It grounded him. It removed the illusion of a final destination and replaced it with something more stable, a path that did not end, but evolved. And in that evolution, there was a kind of quiet satisfaction, not the loud excitement of quick results, but the steady confidence that comes from knowing you are no longer drifting, no longer waiting, no longer making the same quiet deals with comfort that once defined your days. And that confidence did not need to be announced. It showed itself in small, consistent actions, in the absence of hesitation, in the way he moved through his day without the constant internal negotiation that once slowed him down. And when he looked back, not far, just enough to see the difference, he did not see a completely different person. He saw continuity, but directed differently. The same capacity for repetition, the same ability to build patterns, now applied with awareness, with intention. And that made all the difference. And so, if someone were to ask him what changed, he would not point to a single moment, a breakthrough, or a secret method. He would say something simpler, something less satisfying to hear, but more useful to understand. That he stopped waiting for the perfect day, stopped expecting to feel ready, stopped negotiating with the same thoughts that had kept him in place, and instead, he began to act. In small ways, repeatedly, without dropping the line, without allowing zero to become an option. And that is where everything shifted, not in what he did once, but in what he continued to do. And so now, if you are listening to this, not as a story, but as something that feels a little too familiar, the question is not whether you can change, because you already know, somewhere, that you can. The question is whether you are willing to maintain something small, something consistent, something that does not rely on how you feel, because that is where the real shift begins. Not in intensity, not in sudden transformation, but in continuity, in the quiet decision to keep going, even when it would be easier not to. And if there is one thing worth carrying forward from all of this, it is that your future is not built on the days you feel strong. It is built on the days you choose not to stop. So maybe today, not tomorrow, not when it feels right, just today, you keep the line unbroken. You do something, no matter how small, and then you return tomorrow and do it again. And if you can do that, quietly, consistently, without needing it to feel perfect, then you are already further along than you think. And if you choose to stay on this path, to keep listening, to keep reflecting, to keep showing up in your own way, then stay with me, not as a follower, but as someone walking alongside, learning, adjusting, continuing, one day at a time.